Welcome to Law and Justice. I'm Jane Mulcahy. This is a special series on the topic of relationships matter, and today I am joined by Mark Smyth. Hi Mark, thanks for joining me.
Good morning, thanks for having me.
I'm very delighted to have you here, Mark. So to begin, can you just tell me a bit about yourself and your background, please?
Sure, I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in a mental health service. I'm working in mental health for around 20 years now, primarily working with adolescents with significant mental health difficulties. And then I've also for the last couple of years been working with Rugby Players Ireland as the lead for their wellbeing service for the rugby players. And then on the side, then in my not so spare time, but the bit that I have, I also coach a couple of underage GA teams as well, our local club.
Wow, okay. Yeah, that's pretty heavy and hectic and full for sure, Mark. Thanks for that. So as a psychologist, can you explain the significance of attachment for child development and also then the capacity to form safe, healthy relationships as adults, please?
Of course. I think attachment is probably the cornerstone of everything that I do in terms of my work, and particularly working with children and adolescents. I also worked in a care home for children in the care of the state in the high support unit for about 9 years, and in child detention centre. So I suppose I get to see, or have got to see, the impact that not having secure attachments can have in children's development. But I suppose from a very basic point of view, when babies are born, they're completely helpless. They need their carers to provide every aspect of their care, food, their safety, their nurturing, their emotional attachment. And when a child is brought into a home where there is a secure attachment, their needs are met. They get an internalized sense of, I feel safe, I'm okay, my needs are going to be met. I get a consistent response. I think consistency is important from my carer when I'm in distress, be that whether I'm hungry or if I'm tired or if I'm sick or whatever it's going to be. And as the child starts to grow and they develop into a little toddler and they start to move away, they will go so far. And we'll often have seen this with children when they start to crawl, they will move a certain distance and then they stop and they look back to see, is the parent still there? Because at that kind of stage of their cognitive development, they haven't formed the ability to have an internal representation of the parent. So they need to see them to be reassured that they're there. And then as they go and they come back and they see that parent is consistently still there for me, they start to venture a little bit further and still always come back knowing that there's the predictability and safety within that relationship. And then as they grow and they mature and they start school, they start to form new attachments. So with their peers and with their friends, and they have multiple attachment relationships, but still with the core foundation of the relationship with their parent or carer being at the center of that. Then as they move into that adolescent period, that attachment shifts massively towards more their peers rather than the parent. And many parents will talk about being kind of, the taxi driver and meeting the basic needs, the chef and the feeding them. And that's where they will find their identity and they figure out who they are, but always with that safety net of the parent there, because it's tough being an adolescent trying to figure out who you are. And sometimes they will experience rejection and loneliness and struggle to fit in. And when they need to do that is they need to come back then to the parent, the home, and to recharge. And I've used that analogy with parents sometimes of, especially with dads, because they like tech, they get this idea that with robot hoovers is that they go out, they go off and they'll do their thing, and then they come back and they recharge, and then they go off and do it again. And that, especially in early adolescence, that parents are just the recharging unit to allow them to go out and explore the world again. And the dads always get that analogy. The mums look at me, they'll be like, what's he talking about electric hoovers for? But I suppose when children, and this is a reality, come from places where there isn't that attachment or isn't that predictability, it leaves them with a very unsafe, unsecure space within the world, because I don't know if my needs are going to be met today or not. And sometimes it's that unpredictability of it can impact children's attachment more than where there's a consistent, lack of attachment, because the children can just know, okay, I've got to just do this for myself because I can't rely on somebody else. And the kids that I've met that have struggled the most are where one day mommy or daddy loves me and takes care of me, the next day they hate me and they won't look after me. So I don't really know what I'm going to get. So they're very unsure about where their safety in the world is, and that can leave them struggling then with that interaction piece with their peers, because they have no safety net. They have no foundation by which they can go forward and figure out who they are. Because if I don't matter to my parents enough to look after me, then how can I matter to anybody else? So
Yeah, sure.
this sense of being good enough, and when we don't have secure attachment, this internalized sense of ourselves of I'm not good enough, we can then translate and project that onto others around us, because it's not just a felt sense, it's a reality, because I'm not good enough to be given consistent care.
Thank you for that, Mark. And then what is your view about the adverse childhood experiences studies? Is it a useful evidence base?
It is, and I'm glad that it's come into a lot more of our conversations over the last couple of years, and particularly one of the main areas of work is in anxiety. Okay. And struggles with anxiety, and the links between the amount of experiences of ACEs that you've had and anxiety is very, very clear, because it's about predictability. It's about the world not being a safe place. And anxiety is our defense mechanism to keep us safe in the world. But if we've encountered lots of adverse experiences, then it's going to condition us that the world isn't safe. So we're going to be alert all the time. I think what's been helpful about it is that it's helped us to look at people, and children in particular, with a more compassionate lens, and realize that it's not so much them themselves, but it's the environment around them. So if, as a psychologist, I'm doing work with a young person and I'm sending them back into an environment where they're not safe, where they're encountering trauma, then it's very limited what I can do with them, because it's the safe place around them. It's their secure base, literally and symbolically, that they need. So the evidence is clear as well with the ACEs, and from people who struggle with their addiction difficulties, that we see them in a more compassionate, because they have gone through all of these difficult life encounters at a time where they should have been developing and growing, but this got in the way of it. So I'm hopeful that we're going to kind of continue to keep that as part of our conversations. And I think with the new national mental health policy, with sharing the vision, there's a core theme running through all of that is about the recognition of needing to be trauma informed. And I think if we continue that conversation of being trauma informed, then we will always bring ACEs into the conversation.
Okay. And Mark, do you believe that from what you said there, it sounds like you think that psychologists need to be aware of trauma anyway, but do you think maybe early years professionals and teachers and social workers and Gardaí and lawyers and judges and prison officers also need to know what trauma is and how it manifests in order maybe to respond more compassionately and effectively with people?
I think anyone that interacts with people, but particularly if you're in a role or profession where you have responsibility or you're working with people who are vulnerable, I think it's essential that they would have it. Now, you need to know to different levels and degrees, but certainly having it as part of a core curriculum or part of maybe ongoing CPD for different professionals, I think would help to give them a more complete understanding of why the person is thinking or feeling or reacting in the way that they are, and not assume that it's about the person, but it's a product of the experiences that they've had.
And what type of things do you think the training should include? Like, should a bit of a rundown of attachment be part of it rather than say just ACEs? Should it be neurodevelopmentally aware as much as anything else, and maybe include stuff about racism and cultural trauma and a wider thing rather than just say the original 10 ACEs?
Yeah, because I think trauma is it's a wider encompassing umbrella to look at things through rather than just ACEs, because when trauma impacts on people, it's going to be different for different people depending on their life experiences, on the support network that's around them. So if we limit it to just ACEs, then we're potentially going to cut out a whole cohort of people that may not directly have experienced these things. We also know that there's a huge issue with people experiencing vicarious trauma. Yeah. So it's from hearing about it or seeing it and being exposed to trauma, not directly themselves. So if we use that wider umbrella and understanding of what trauma is, then we're going to take in more people, understanding how it affects people. So I think, yes, it needs to be broader than that, but also, as you said, the pieces around attachment, but understanding the links between how trauma impacts attachment and then how that directly links onto relationships. So they're all going to be on a continuum, and if we just pick one certain section, we're going to miss out on the broader understanding, but also how one directly knocks onto the other.
Okay. Bessel van der Kolk, Mark, stated during a training that I did a few years ago before the pandemic that the therapeutic relationship is the key factor really in change, especially where a therapist can help the person with affect regulation. So in a clinical mental health setting, is the relationship between the psychologist or the psychiatrist or psychotherapist as well understood and elevated as it should be, do you think?
It's a great question. Is it as understood as it should be? Probably not. I think at times when you have an overly maybe medicalized approach to looking at mental health, I think it's less well understood. From my own perspective, it is the relationship. It's key to everything. And I think we need to, certainly when I work with trainees as part of our training programs, the importance of the therapeutic relationship is the thing that we can't emphasize enough. Because we have people coming to us who are feeling vulnerable. They don't feel very good in themselves. They don't trust people because, especially working with adolescents, one of the things that they fear the most is being judged. They're terrified of it because they spend most of the time judging themselves. So they need to feel safe. I gave a talk a few years ago, and the opening slide was, "Trust me, I'm a psychologist." And I had lots of mental health professionals in the room, all kind of nodding away. Yeah, this is going to be good. And then the next slide was, "Why the hell should you?" Because trust, like in any relationship, trust has to be earned. And I think just because we're in a particular profession doesn't mean that automatically we should be trusted. We know from research that in mental health recovery that 50% of the variance within whether someone recovers or not is about the relationship and the fit between the person and the therapist. So what's really, really important is that you work on that relationship, and relationships in any setting, be that a romantic or a friendship or family or therapeutic, require work. They don't just happen automatically. So you need to give that person a sense of who you are. So in my private work, when I meet someone for the first time, at the end of the session, I make no plan to see them again. I say, now, we've met once, you've got a sense of me. Now you go away and you have a think about whether I'm the right fit for you or not. And if I am, brilliant, come back to me and we'll do some work. And if I'm not, then that's okay. It's just about the fit, and I'll try and find someone else for you.
That's nice. Yeah, and honest, and kind of throwing the ball into their court and giving a bit of power. Yeah,
because you have to address there is a power dynamic within and a hierarchy within kind of therapy and use the therapist, and you have to be really careful about managing and minding that, and allowing people to feel like the relationship is the right one for them. Because I would have, and I would let people know in that first session, I do have quite a direct style. That suits lots of people, and there's others that it doesn't, and that's okay. It's about them feeling that it's safe. But I think there's also a lot of potential within kind of relationships within doing therapy for it to be quite healing. I'd have a lot of young people who would, especially when I worked in the care system, who are very angry at the world, and they've experienced multiple rejections and people abandoning them. And sometimes within these young people, they can really push you hard. There's, as I've said to a few of them, they don't need to worry about offending me, because after doing this for 20 years with teenagers, there's no name I haven't been called. And I tell them if there's a name they call me that I haven't been called before, I'll shake their hand. Well, pre-COVID world, I would have. But it's also that, I said it to someone that, look, I know what you're trying to do is push me away because you're afraid of getting close, because getting close increases the risk of you getting hurt. And I know you're going to do it, but I'm not going anywhere. And I think that's that piece, is that they throw whatever they have at you, and you don't go anywhere. And they see that, okay, this person can take me whatever I throw at them, they're not rejecting me, and that kind of makes them feel a little bit safe. But the hard part about that is that when they feel that sense of kind of safety within the relationship, it also has to come to an end.
Yes.
So you have to plan for that, and especially with doing the longer term work, I would plan for endings sometimes 9-10 months out to start to mention it, because they've taken such a leap of faith to trust in somebody, and they feel safe. But it's also that you want that person to be able to be independent as well. So while the relationship is key, you have to work hard at managing it so that the young person, particularly within a mental health setting, doesn't become dependent of the relationship. Or that you support them to find other relationships that will step in instead with their peers or with their friends or whatever it's going to be, so that you're acting as a conduit to other relationships. So if we're not thinking about or or actively working on relationships in mental health as a mental health person working in mental health, then you're doing something wrong. So it's central to everything.
Yeah. And then, well, you described there a very kind of sensible and yet heart-centered way of engaging with people. But is there also a danger that within the therapeutic practice, where a person has a trauma history, that it can lead to repetition, compulsion, and interactions with mental health professionals? Like you described the boys trying to push you away and push your buttons, call you names. Is that part of a cycle, a kind of traumatic reenactment almost, that you'd be like everyone else who's ever come before?
Yeah, so the people will come with their own templates for how they view others and expectations that you're going to, as you said, repeat cycles of maybe how people have interacted with each other again. And I think certainly anything people who've worked with me will kind of attest to this. I can be quite unpredictable. I can come out with something completely left field, because some of them will come in with pre-prepared scripts of what they're going to say and how they think I'm going to respond and how they're going to respond when I respond in a certain way. And having an awareness of the dynamic that's occurring in the room allows you to basically not go along with that script, particularly if it's one where they experience the potential for negativity. So I can just in the middle of something completely change topic to something completely random and what? Or just name it with them. Does this feel like you're reenacting something that might have happened with whoever that person might be? And that makes sense why you would be doing that, because in a lot of ways, even if that happens, it allows them to process difficult emotions or experiences in a safe place with a safe person. So in particular, I'm thinking of maybe some adolescent girls who may have been sexually assaulted or sexually abused. To be in a room with an adult male in itself, it can be quite anxiety provoking. But also what many of them would say is that they would have a preference for a male therapist because they need to realign their perception of safety within the world, and that to show them that I can be in a relationship, a therapeutic relationship, where this person doesn't want to hurt me.
Yeah, wow.
And you know, they can go away long. At least there is some people in the world who don't want to cause harm to me.
Yeah.
And again, that's the relationship piece.
Yeah. Oh, that's very powerful, and I can see why that would be healing for young women who were victims of sexual violence. Are mental health services adequately funded in Ireland, Mark?
Oh, not even close. So we've been hovering around the 6% of the overall health budget for a number of years, and it dipped below that last year. We know that, particularly with psychology, my own profession, in CAMS, there are 98 psychologists short of the 190 recommended, and that was based on 2014 recommendations from Vision for Change, and they're based alongside population based on the census data. But we know that the population has grown since then, so the gaps are actually more likely to be higher than that. With our social work colleagues, they are 96 short for CAMS alone. So we're just not producing enough graduates. We're not training enough graduates to meet the demand either now or into the future. We've seen that the government produced a 10-year strategy looking at disability services, looking at capacity, and they estimated they needed 110% increase in the number of psychologists just for child disability, but yet there's no plan for where we're going to get them from. Okay. So we don't have the funding, and even if funding is allocated, it's not being spent in the ways where it's needed. We see that with the eating disorder teams, where the rollout of what's required is nowhere near meeting demand. Okay.
And also, it's quite expensive for people to train. Isn't that another problem in terms of recruitment and getting a diverse pool of young psychologists into the system? Is that a barrier, Mark? The cost of training?
Yeah, there is. I know for a number of years, the only assistant psychologist posts tended to be voluntary. So people were trying to work other jobs on the side to get the experience to get into training. Now, if they get into clinical training, yes, they are paid and funded, but the counselling psychologists and the educational psychologists aren't paid or funded. So they pay roughly about 14,000 a year for the 3 years of the training and work for free for 3 years. Wow. So that has a huge impact. So it's over 40,000 over the course of your training while working for free. And that does, from a socioeconomic point of view, limit down the pool of people. So we don't have a workforce that's representative, because either people have to put themselves into significant debt, or it's only people coming from a particular maybe socioeconomic background that can afford to go into training. And that's not really going to be good for the profession or our ability to have a diverse range of psychologists that can work with our population, which is much more diverse than it used to be.
And then with COVID and the fact that, well, it impacted us all in various ways, and that was normal to feel stress and distress due to the uncertainty. But some kids and some adults too were living in unsafe situations for a prolonged period of time with no access to helping services. Do you think that's going to have a knock-on impact in terms of people who need support, and then put further strain on an already strained and underfunded system?
Oh, it's been happening for about well over a year. So the rate of referrals coming in to mental health services, to private practitioners, is completely overwhelming demand. And it's not just the numbers coming through, but it's also the severity, the level of difficulty that people are experiencing. And we know that the more severe the impact of a person's mental health on them, the more supports they will need, and the longer that work takes. So when services were already underfunded and overstretched, then experience a significant increase in referral numbers and complexity, then it puts a pressure on the system so much that the system could break.
Yeah, it's very worrying indeed. So I'm going to ask you now a little bit about your sporting side of things, but also how that might relate to raising trauma awareness, because I'm doing my design thinking course at UCC on how might we raise awareness among sports coaches of trauma and the healing power of relationships. I'm probably going to shift it so that it's more positive. So more on the well-being side, how can we enhance child well-being or something like that? But how did you get into coaching yourself, Mark?
I used to coach back when I was younger, to coach badminton, but then I've got 3 kids, and in our local club there's a sign at the gate as you go in, before you complain, have you volunteered? So
I like it.
Okay. And it's also just for my kids were starting GA, they were a little bit anxious about it, but knowing people, and I knew some of the coaches already, so it was kind of just a natural fate of, well, you're bringing them, you're going to be there anyway, you might as well be part of it and help out. So I'd done a little bit of work for the club before, doing kind of some talks around anxiety, so I was very familiar with them, and it's a nice thing to do. I work with kids, so why not do coaching with them too? It's just an extension of the day-to-day work, I think.
Yeah, I've spoken to some other dads and coaches as well, and they seem to go kind of hand in hand. It's a lovely thing to do. But do you think that coaches would benefit from basic awareness of what stress and trauma does, and how safe, healthy relationships can be buffering?
I think certain numbers and would need it. I think it's hard to find the time, especially when parents are all volunteers, to get them to commit to another course. As it is, they have to do mandatory courses on child protection, which they have to do and should be doing. But I think it should be a national conversation. If we're going to do it, we should do it en masse and for all sports and all coaches, and have it part of each of the sporting bodies filtering it down from above. I think we've lots of systems where on a local level there might be kind of good initiatives, but then it can be patchy. So I think if we're going to do it, we should do it right. And the GAA, the FAI, RFU, and all the others committing to a common curriculum, because I think, especially when we talk about something like trauma, we have to do so in a very safe way. And I think there's lots of really good initiatives, but there isn't a consistency to what's been talked about. So if there's an agreed national curriculum on kind of educating coaches and people in general on trauma and the impact of it, and how you can foster kind of good relationships with people, I think that would be helpful, because then everyone would be having the same kind of conversation to the same degree. But I think that would take a lot of work, probably maybe driven by government to bring that on board. But there's certainly scope for it.
Yeah, and the reason that I chose this focus for my project was that I was watching an interview with Dr. Bruce Perry with Megan Bartlett from the neurosequential model of sport. And he was saying that if coaches were 5% more trauma informed and developmentally sensitive, we could get, he didn't use the phrase bang for our buck, but basically more therapeutic dividend in a way, than hiring a whole new cohort of trauma therapists. And I guess that's because of the weekly interactions, the kind of dosage of the relationship, and the fact that it's real. But do you think, Mark, that flipping it into the positive, so to kind of focus more on how coaches are already doing great work and they're already quite relationally sensitive and, you know, providing kids with lots of fun and belonging, and that just if they were a tiny bit more aware that sometimes behaviors might be masking something else, or that the child is stressed or maybe has a neurodevelopmental issue, maybe neurodivergence, that would help them maybe be more compassionate in the moment.
Yeah, no, I definitely think so, because we need to move away from just this idea of child refuses to do certain drill, child is bold. Child could be hungry, they could be scared of going home, they could be, as you said, the neurodivergent kind of profile that are there. And it's interesting for me, just as a psychologist and as a coach working with these children, that I can kind of spot sometimes kids that might have some additional difficulties. And then you can adapt your style and to try and work with that. That, you know, not to rely too much on using just verbal strategies all the time, but to use visual to show and show and tell rather than just tell. But also it's having that awareness of just the relationships that the kids have with each other.
Yes.
Because we understand the impact of trauma and about that safety within it. It's important for coaches to make sure that the environment is safe, and that the children are safe with each other, that they're respectful to each other, to be mindful of the impact of exclusion and bullying. And I think when we have those kind of conversations and include it in our thinking as coaches, then we're much more likely to create a safe environment for the children.
And do you have any ideas? I mean, you mentioned that a national conversation and government support would be good for this, but any ideas about what the best way of giving coaches digestible information might be, Mark? Like talks or online content or videos, or what do you think might work?
I think it has to be all the above, because if we're going to try and get the large amount of people, then you have to try and make it accessible, you have to make it interesting. And what we've learned from COVID is that you get more people involved when it's online, because it's more likely to be at a time where they can actually find the time to do it. But also indigestible. So we know that social media content, people will see it. Oh, that's interesting. I'll engage with that. So I think it has to be multimodal, in person, online, videos, social media clips, whatever it's going to be to get that conversation out there. But again, it just needs to be a consistency of it, and maybe brought into kind of the policies of different clubs. And have, you know, a role within the club or within the coaching structure of someone that is there to coordinate it. Yeah.
And with the social media dimension, do you think like high profile people who, let's say, for whom sport participation and a relationship with the coach was really significant in their lives? For example, I don't know, Philly McMahon or people, that also, and I'm sure there are many others as well, you know, random people too for whom the coaching relationship was important, but maybe a kind of campaign driven by public sports figures, might that help as well, get people clicking and watching videos, do you think?
Yeah, no, it does, because these are, especially for coaches, they're interested in these players, and for the coaches themselves and the kids, they look up to these and listen to it. And I suppose that one of the really good examples of that is through Rugby Players Ireland. So they have a Tackle Your Feelings campaign, where a number of the high profile men and women's players have come out and told their own stories, and in online and in animations and in videos and in talks. And I think that's been helpful, because it particularly with rugby, with a perception that it's about, you know, strength and about, you know, hiding your feelings, to show that they feel as much as everybody else does, and take a really positive step as role models to get people to come forward and to talk about relationships and to talk about the impacts that they've had on them, both positive and negative. So I think that's been really, really well received. It's in schools at the moment, so they're delivering this program to transition years, and it's getting a fantastic reception.
That sounds great. Final question, Mark, and thanks so much for joining me again. What can politicians and policymakers do to promote safe, healthy relationships in childhood and across our life course?
I think what they can do is fund early intervention services, particularly, with getting kind of help early, with providing supports to parents. Parenting can be a very stressful and anxiety-provoking experience for a lot of people, where parental self-doubt is one of the greatest challenges that I come across. Yeah. So having good early intervention educational programs for parents that allow them to be parents and to deal with the challenges that are going to arise. And if challenges do arise, that the state can respond to early intervention. And I think particularly we see that in disability services, where parents are struggling perhaps more than most, because they're waiting 3, 4, sometimes 5 years for their young child to get the help that they need. And that impacts on other relationships within the family, because the parents are stressed, they're worried, they're trying to work extra hours to get private funding to get their kid the help they need. So we talk about reducing things like stigma on mental health and on disability and come forward and talk. But if we do that, then there has to be someone available to listen and someone available to provide that support. And I think we've paid lip service to mental health for too many years. And if government is going to actually stand up and be counted, then we don't need to be arguing over 0.5% here, 0.5% there in terms of the overall health budget. They need to bring it up to between 10 and 12%, which is the rest of the civilized world in terms of health budget. So we need to see where the money is.
Okay. We'll leave it there, Mark. Thank you so much. This has been Relationship Matters with Jay Mulcahy, and my guest today was Mark Smyth. Thanks a million, Mark. It's been great talking to you.